I'd like to welcome our chair for today, Peter Bunting, who is the Assistant General Secretary of the Irish Congress of Trade Unions. And without any further ado, I'll hand over to Peter. Just to mention that lunch is in the Long Stone. That's where we're going for. It's the Long Stone, isn't it, Tom? Yeah, Long Stone.
Where's that?
It's around the corner. We'll explain to you when this session is over.
Thanks very much, Frank. Anyway, comrades, good morning. You're all very welcome. There was a very prescient decision by the Institute to organise a meeting concentrated on the Good Friday Agreement, considering that we have a lot of anxious moments with regards to the Good Friday Agreement and progressive movement in the political environment in Northern Ireland. You'll all obviously are interested, otherwise you wouldn't be here. So I assume you're quite up to date and up to speed with what's happening in the Stormont, and indeed also, I suppose, to a certain extent, there's the implications of the Scottish referendum circling around that particular environment as well. I'm delighted to sort of have a wonderful panel here of speakers who are very au fait with the situation in Northern Ireland. We have Anne Kilwater, who is a journalist, a caseworker with the Pat Finucane Centre for Human Rights. Unfortunately, is going to speak in the middle with her particular slideshow. We're also hoping that some computer geek may arrive to help us fix this problem we have and allow then probably for Anne to speak to her slides in a better way. So we kick off first of all this morning with Declan Kearney, who's the National Chair of Sinn Féin. Declan's going to speak first, then Anne, and then Tom McGurk, who you all are aware of as well. Is a broadcaster and also a columnist for the Sunday Business Post. And many years ago, when I knew him, he was in the People's Democracy in Belfast. Probably too many years ago for memories. But also, obviously, as well, he writes quite succinctly and knowledgeably about Northern Ireland political situation as well. So first of all, we'll have Declan Kearney, the National Chair of Sinn Féin. Thank you.
Well, ar an chéadal sias bhhailm mahuias a gohfuil leis an coiste stúrtha socht an dé seo bhuirtú chun Lordslip ar maidin. Tá sé de privilege dúsa an dé se glacu chun an cur láthair seo a bhuirt. In san scoilsairí seo an Ómós Desmond Greaves, scríbneoir agraí Swinshore arú tionachar suntasach ar lei aige ar híal agus ar flitíocht an Loch Debre agus an Phoblacht Tana sis in san tír seo agus atá an go dtí an lá atá aniu. So míle buíthe Steve go léir margheallar sin ar fad. I want to address my remarks in relation to the Good Friday Agreement in context with the current situation in the North today, aptly introduced by Peter, our chair today. The Good Friday Agreement of 1998 represented a framework of principles and political structures that helped embed conflict resolution and the fledgling peace process in the North. It opened up a democratic road forward and established a political process to resolve the circumstances that had perpetuated the conflict on the island and particularly in the North. The political and the civic structures proposed by the agreement were architectured to entrench and to manage a democratic process of change that was required in the 6 counties. It wasn't a Republican document, but it did include mechanisms and political dynamics that had the ability to support the achievement of a national democracy on the island, and it made specific provision in that regard for a border poll. It was a political compromise between opponents, and it conferred an absolute responsibility upon the British and the Irish governments to ensure that the agreement was implemented in binding international terms. So its historic and strategic significance was in recognising that the status quo had failed Irish society, and that shaping the future was now going to depend upon the management of change through democratic compromise and agreement on an ongoing basis. That's why the Good Friday Agreement constituted a watershed with regard to the practice of political relations on the island and between the island of Ireland and Britain. And nothing could or would ever remain the same after that point. The Good Friday Agreement concretised the Irish peace process and it made it irreversible. And while the DUP orchestrated opposition to the agreement and its implementation, there were mixed messages sent out by the Ulster Unionist Party, which was in the majority in political unionism at that stage. Neither the peace process nor the phase of politics begun by the Good Friday Agreement was ever positively embraced by political unionism. Constructive leadership was never demonstrated by those parties in their own constituency. Compromise and change were presented by them in zero-sum terms. Indeed, many within the broader popular unionist and Protestant community who did speak out in favour of the agreement were ostracised and politically criticised. From the outset, political unionism failed to unanimously and unequivocally support the Good Friday Agreement principles and process. And significant sections from 1998 have remained consistently hostile to both the power sharing and the partnership government arrangements with Republicans and in particular with Sinn Féin. Despite all of that, the peace process did move forward. Demilitarisation did occur on all sides. Prisoner releases were agreed. A new beginning to policing and reform of the criminal justice system was taken forward. And the new political institutions did begin to function in tandem with all Ireland bodies. The equality legislation promised and the equality agenda itself became mainstreamed. And in time, the late Ian Paisley took his party, the DUP, into joint government with Sinn Féin. Yet critical fault lines remained, specifically in the failure to deal with the legacy of the past, secure parity of esteem, entrench mutual respect, eradicate sectarian attitudes and behaviour, and sectarian segregation, and the promotion of a reconciliation process as a climax to all of that. And all of those issues and others have combined to consistently challenge the political process. The continued failure and opposition to tackle these realities was forcefully illustrated, most recently by the refusal of political unionism to accept the Haas compromise proposals last January, and more recently when all the unionist parties staged a walkout from a new round of leaders' talks in relation to the Haas agenda, and that was in protest against the Parades Commission decision to uphold the determination in relation to the Ardoyne March, the Orange March at Ardoyne. Instead, political unionism has been emboldened in their intransigence towards these issues by the British government's refusal to endorse the Haas package itself. And this current political deadlock that I speak about has been compounded by the failure of both the British and the Irish governments to implement core elements of the Good Friday Agreement itself from 1998, the subsequent agreements made at Weston Park, at St Andrews, and then in 2010 at Hillsborough Castle. And the consequence of all that has been that the political process has remained constantly fragile throughout. In turn, the potential for developing authentic reconciliation has remained undermined and held back. Both governments have stepped back from their responsibilities as co-guarantors of the Good Friday Agreement. The Irish government has remained semi-detached and passive, but since Cameron's Conservative Party took power 4 years ago, this particular British government's Irish policy has become markedly more pro-unionist and increasingly resembles the explicitly partisan nature of the John Major government policy that was adopted during the mid-1990s. During the last 2 years, political instability in the North has intensified due to the primacy of bad leadership in unionism, and an unfolding crisis within political unionism has now been exacerbated by sectarian electoral competition and cooperation among unionist politicians and unionist paramilitaries. The current situation that I speak about stems back to the marching season of 2012, just over 2 years ago. the subsequent street disturbances, which were orchestrated by unionist paramilitaries from both the UDA and the UVF at that time, during the summer and autumn, and then the refusal of the DUP and the UUP to respect the democratic decision that was taken by Belfast City Council in relation to changed arrangements around the flying of the Union flag. And that was on the basis of a compromise. That all led directly to months of street violence and attacks on the Alliance Party, Catholic homes in Catholic areas, the PSNI itself, and threats against Sinn Féin members. Later in August, some months later, in August of 2013, Peter Robinson then reneged on the now infamous issue around Maze Long Cash. But the important thing to stress about his decision to renege on the decision not to proceed with Maze Long Cash is that that removed a central pillar of the agreed programme for government in the North. And his announcement was made in a letter that he sent to DUP members from his holidays in Florida. He didn't contact Martin McGuinness, and he met Martin McGuinness 2 days before he left and gave no indication that that was his intent. And that approach, that type of approach that I described, has increasingly defined the nature of DUP participation in the political institutions within the executive and within the office of OFM and DFM itself. And a renewed toxic sectarian incivility has absolutely infected the whole character and operation of the Assembly in the North itself. You see, the DUP and the UUP, Democratic Unionist Party and the Ulster Unionist Party, may well have bought into the political institutions in terms of electoral influence, salaries and status. But the reality is that that has never extended to embracing a genuine willingness to share power with Republicans, support real partnership government, the development of North-South cooperation, to support mutual respect, parity of esteem, or to promote reconciliation. And the contemporary agenda of unionism has been set by orange and unionist extremists. Political unionism, as a result, has shifted to the right, adopted a strategy of political blockage, and it has acquiesced time and time again in the face of escalating sectarianism, growing racism, and indeed homophobia within the 6 counties. And all of that has inevitably undermined the credibility of the executive and the Assembly itself. And it's fettered the potential of those particular institutions to work as delivery mechanisms for sufficient economic and social change within the worst disadvantaged areas of the North. Since the May elections, all sections now of political unionism, including the explicitly anti-agreement TUV, that's Jim Allister's party, and those parties linked to the UDA and the UVF, have formed a pan-unionist coalition, ostensibly to oppose the Parades Commission and its decision on the Ardoyne Orange March, but they also want a generalised non-regulation of orange marches right across the board. So, and this is the worrying thing in this particular period, an anti-agreement axis, an anti-Good Friday agreement axis has now developed within unionism, and that is aimed at subverting the Good Friday Agreement itself, its principles and its process. That anti-agreement axis is against equality, it's against democratic compromise and the management of continued change in the North. Its agenda is to turn the clock back. So there is a right-wing retreat taking place by political unionism into the old Orange State ideology. Let me spell out for you just what that means. That includes key members of the DUP's officer team. It includes individuals from within its Assembly team and also its Westminster team of representatives. It includes the TUV, UKIP, as it is organised in the North, and other figures within the Orange Order, the UVF and the UDA. And the ascendancy of that particular anti-agreement axis now, the pro-unionist position of the Northern Ireland Office, the NIO, the refusal of the British government to fulfil its commitments now constitutes the most serious political threat to the viability of the political institutions in the North. As a result, power sharing and partnership government are being directly and immediately undermined. All the indications suggest that this DUP leadership is resigned to freewheeling into a crash of the political institutions because they can't have things their own way and are enthralled to the most negative elements within their own party. Peter Robinson's call this week for a new negotiation should be read as code. Code for the removal of the safeguards and the protections enshrined in the Good Friday Agreement, and in an attempt to undermine all of the other succeeding agreements. The attempt to explain it away and explain what is happening by him as a disagreement over welfare cuts in the North is preposterous and absurd. The leadership and the political resolve clearly does not exist within political unionism to face down the extremists or to make power sharing and partnership government work. So the default position has now become political stasis and an attempt to try and turn the clock backwards. In the last 6 months, the DUP leadership has already threatened to bring down the institutions three times. Once over the on-the-runs situation, secondly over the Parades Commission determination in relation to the Ardoyne March by the Orange Order, and thirdly, most recently, over welfare cuts itself. However, the recklessness and the irresponsibility of the political unionist leaderships are being encouraged by the failure of the British government to intervene and stop that growing stasis. It has repeatedly, in recent months and longer, shown its willingness to capitulate and its unwillingness to stand up to unionist threats and intransigence. More of that was most recently evidenced in Theresa Villiers' speech at the British-Irish Association over in Britain last weekend. And then when Charlie Flanagan, in his Sunday Independent interview the following day, sought to caricature the Northern impasse as a failure by parties to deliver basic services, he completely ignored the reality that the democratic core of the Good Friday Agreement is now being hollowed out. And that is being hollowed out by an energised anti-agreement axis. The existing political impasse contains all the potential to develop into a full-blown political crisis. It is being deepened by the hands-off attitude of both the British and the Irish governments towards the unfinished business of the Good Friday Agreement, the Weston Park Agreement, and then St Andrews and Hillsborough Castle agreements as well. Despite the narrative of the British and the Irish governments, the North is not a settled issue. The fact is that the political process in the 6 counties is now in deep trouble. And that reality is further compounded by Theresa Villiers' consideration of a new concession to unionist demands for an inquiry into the Parades Commission decision on Ardoyne, and and in terms of the British government's draconian welfare cuts proposed against the working poor and the most vulnerable in Northern society. So to repeat this point, welfare cuts for Sinn Féin is a line which we will not cross, because it is a denial of social justice and it's also bad economics. Progressive, democratic and Labour opinion should oppose the introduction of this Thatcherite agenda by the Conservatives, which is now supported by every single shade of political unionism. However, I don't believe that the lurch to the right by the unionist parties is representative of wider unionist and Protestant opinion. There is a correlation between this and political unionism's decision to support welfare cuts and abandon any pretext of defending the social and the economic needs of the disadvantaged citizens which those parties purport to represent. So the political landscape in the North now is being defined in 2 respects, not only by a polarisation between pro and anti-agreement positions, but also a stark ideological division on socio-economic issues and the role of government itself in relation to the protection of those least able to look after themselves. Contrary to the stated purpose of Peter Robinson's intervention this week, there is no evidence that the British government, the NIO or political unionism is in fact open to a serious process of negotiation on all the critical and the outstanding issues. In fact, we should allow that this is simply an extension of the time-buying exercise which the DUP used to get them through the European election campaign last April and May. A remarkably similar scenario is now shaping up with the Westminster election set for next year. If this downward political spiral continues, a new cycle of elections will fuel the extremes within Orangism and Unionism. And in that context, the probability grows that this deep impasse will lead to a very serious political vacuum. That's why Gerry Adams said during the summer that the political process now faces its greatest challenge since the Good Friday Agreements in 1998. A carnival of reaction is now underway against the ongoing change begun by the Good Friday Agreement, and its purpose is to minimise, dilute, change and then maximise the delay for that change happening. And that must not be allowed to succeed. The present political situation challenges everyone who aspires to political stability, progress, reconciliation, and who supports the Good Friday Agreement and successive agreements after that. Widespread disappointment does exist towards the political institutions in the North. There's a real concern about the political instability within local communities and real fear in relation to the upsurge in sectarianism and racism. This current political situation is now both untenable and unsustainable. And in that context, and particularly for this summer school's consideration, there is an absolute imperative on all strands of national, democratic and progressive opinion, north and south, to now mobilise in support of a pro-agreement axis. Defending the integrity of the Good Friday Agreements and process should be a cross-party, cross-community and non-sectarian and democratic objective. The British and Irish governments, with diplomatic support from the US administration, must become focused upon that. An immediate trilateral intervention should be taken by the three governments to restore political stability in the process, to open new political negotiations, and address the need for an economic reconstruction plan in the North. Those are the foundations. Those are the foundations for the development of a reconciliation process. Make no mistake about the approach which is now required. It is the political model and the momentum originally used to facilitate the original Good Friday Agreements that is required in relation to the situation that now obtains. The original political model and momentum of the Good Friday Agreement must be urgently redeployed, and there is no alternative to that approach. Any approach to negotiations which starts in reverse, or seeks to narrow or reduce the talks agenda, or panders to unionist threats and preconditions will fail. If political unionism is unwilling to engage positively in new talks based upon acceptance of Good Friday Agreement principles, then the required momentum must be applied by the Irish and the British governments to ensure that all outstanding issues and commitments are finally implemented and that the political structures are entrenched to ensure that the gains of the peace and the political processes to date are defended. This much is clear. New negotiations are now essential and inevitable in the North. But it is not for political unionism to set or dictate the terms or negotiations and scope of a new talks process on the basis of what it wants. That will not be happening. The Good Friday Agreement was born out of engagement and dialogue, and that has been the catalyst for this phase of the Irish peace process. Now 16 years on, the focus of the next phase must be upon the development of reconciliation. And despite the recrimination, there is widespread acceptance and recognition of the need for reconciliation and healing. That too will require widespread engagement and dialogue across the community to ensure that the past political failures are not recycled and passed on to a new generation. There is no alternative to, and there can't be any avoidance of, the need for engagement, dialogue and visionary leadership. In conclusion, friends, that's the legacy of the Good Friday Agreement today, and that will be the key to creating an agreed, multicultural and united Ireland. Where am I?
I was under the impression we're on a panel this morning, so I didn't prepare as detailed and as significant a contribution as Declan has just given us. And really what he has said is extraordinarily serious. I had no idea that the situation on the ground and in the Assembly had become as serious as that. It's perhaps a measure of how this 26 county state treats all this, that these remarks are not being covered by a bunch of journalists here this morning. Because what Declan has said is hugely significant and hugely important. 15 years ago, the Good Friday Agreement was reached, and it was yet another attempt to resolve the historic British-Irish problem. At partition, unionism was given two vetoes, a constitutional veto and a political veto. The Good Friday Agreement removed the political veto and left in place the constitutional veto. So unionism found itself in a very strange territory indeed. Its mortal enemies were becoming ministers of the Queen. Its mortal enemies had come from paramilitarism into constitutionalism. And the pragmatic approach, the political pragmatism of Sinn Féin has absolutely astonished and stumped unionism. It has left them in a very strange situation, because at this moment in time, all sorts of things are beginning to happen which were once unimaginable. You look, for example, at next Thursday, the vote in Scotland, and the implications of that, particularly for a Northern Unionist community who had long linkages with Scotland. In fact, the majority of the regional planters came from the west of Scotland. And to them, the notion of Scotland leaving the United Kingdom and going independent, although it's a very strange sort of independence which wants to keep the Queen and the pound sterling, but nevertheless, the notion of that part of the United Kingdom breaking up. Secondly, you have, for the first time, I think, in 300 years, a major crisis within the British body politic. That is the EU reaction, the arrival of UKIP, the emergence of British nationalism, and all of those things have suddenly, utterly changed the face of politics in Britain. Again, it's come out of the blue. I don't think they expected it. I don't think they ever anticipated it. In the beginning, UKIP was a joke. It's no longer a joke. It's not only making ground with the Conservatives, it's also making ground with the Labour support. So you have a situation where, set off by the EU's immigration policy, it has unleashed a form of English nationalism. So Britain politically is now a hugely troubled society. And were the Scottish vote to be yes on Thursday, you could have Cameron gone, you could have Miliband gone, you could have a general election. And even if it's no, I believe that that wave of opinion in Scotland is now so powerful it will not go away. The notion that if there's a no vote next Thursday, they'll all quietly go back to bed is not going to happen. Particularly if you look at the Scottish vote, where the vast majority of people under 45 are voting yes. Now, interestingly, for what Declan's been talking about, if there's no vote next Thursday, then we get to what's called maxi devolution, where Westminster, in an attempt to pacify the Scots once again, are going to give them extra powers in relation to tax collection and social welfare and so forth. That will in turn lead to a similar demand for that to be brought into the Northern Assembly. That potentially could provoke a very real crisis, because if we get to that level of economic control political economic control, the fundamental differences between Sinn Féin economically, politically, and the DUP economically, politically will emerge. You'll have the re-emergence of a left-right consensus. Now, in response to what Declan has said, I'm deeply concerned and worried at where it's gone, but in many ways, unionism has always reminded me of one of those exotic creatures that David Attenborough turns up in the jungle, and they shed a skin. They shed a skin over a period of time, and all through their lives they're shedding a skin. Terence O'Neill attempted to shed a skin, and the man who died yesterday put an end to that. Within our lifetimes, unionism has shed various skins. Perhaps the biggest skin of all that was shed was when Paisley came in and agreed to the Good Friday Agreement. But now, as I see it, unionism sees itself in a different situation. It has the political crisis emerging in the United Kingdom. It has the old nationalist, unionist numbers game now becoming tighter and tighter, with the percentages on either side narrowing and narrowing. It sees a pragmatic Sinn Féin that is faultless in its observance of the Good Friday Agreement, that is prepared to go and dress up in a white tie and have dinner with the Queen in Windsor Castle. Jesus' sake, I mean, waving Union Jacks is hardly going to offend people who go and have dinner with the Queen. So unionism has for a long time depended on certain attitudes among republicanism and amongst its enemies, but pragmatically those have disappeared. For good, bad or indifferent, Sinn Féin have gone straight into the democratic process, have worked it out, have built the Assembly, have built a local democracy in Northern Ireland, and have campaigned for equality. So unionism was looking down the road at 5 or 10 or 15 years and saying, where is this headed? And then they look south and they see the huge growth of Sinn Féin in the south and the potential that Sinn Féin will become a major player in government down here next time around in an election. So it's very troubled because it sees itself trapped in a situation where bit by bit its powers are disappearing. And in a fundamental political sense, unionism was never a political force. It was essentially a post-colonial reactionary force. Its political ambitions was to maintain whatever advantage the particular historical and constitutional circumstances gave it at the time. That was his attitude in the last century, that was his attitude of partition, that was his attitude in the 60 years of the colony we had in the north, and now that's his attitude again, because it's now facing a situation where it's not getting enough out of this situation. It's not getting the advantage. I mean, if you look at the psychology of its inability to deal with the past and its inability to deal with flags, its inability to deal with the past is its inability to come to terms with the nature of the society it created, with the causes of what created paramilitary violence in Northern Ireland, and its inability to accept its failure politically to create a society in the north for reasonable human beings. The flag stuff, of course, is utter and complete nonsense. I think people in the United Kingdom in Britain are astonished at the sight of the flag crisis, but nevertheless it means something hugely important to them. And there's another thing I started which is running parallel to what Declan was talking about, the emergence of what's called the Northern Irish thing. Now, for the first time ever, in a sense, the benefits of the United Kingdom are not being mediated through unionism. Up to the end of the old Stormont government, the benefits of the United Kingdom, the benefits of living in that economy, were mediated through unionism. That has disappeared now. And suddenly you have a direct linkage, and that's important. For the first time since partition, you have nationalists in the north who have direct access and linkage into the United Kingdom and are getting reasonably their fair share in a situation of equality. And that has given rise to this new sort of consensus called Northern Irish, where young people in the North are saying they're not Irish, they're not British, they're Northern Irish. I think they're saying something there. And I must say it was quite interesting, because if you think that the whole campaign about ending partition in the United Ireland was to create a society of equality, to create a society where benefit would be not advantaged by the historical past, to find yourself in a situation in the North where that Northern Irish thing begins to suggest that a society can function within the United Kingdom, can function with equality and without discrimination. And suddenly ending partition becomes not that attractive anymore. The other regrettable thing about what has happened since the Good Friday Agreement is that it has been a powerful pro-partitionist force in the South. Almost psychologically, the moment the document was signed, I think culturally, politically, in both the media and political establishment down here, they said, that's the North sorted, that's the North over, nothing to do with us anymore, meet them every so often in Dundalk, bring them down to the odd dinner, but we're out of this now. And in the result, there has been this extraordinary growth of colonial nostalgia down here. We have a level of memory of World War I that is simply inconceivable. We have people in this country at the moment dressing people up in red coats with muskets down in Mayo to fire shots over the grave of Victoria Cross Irishmen from the Indian Army who, without no doubt, slaughtered the natives in great numbers. So suddenly the emergence of this neo-colonial thing has emerged. It's been dressed up as you know, how we forgot those who died in World War I, but it's a leveling, it's a taking on the consensus, it's a saying to the sort of, the consensus that has ruled this country since Fianna Fáil took over in the 1930s, that there was another story. And of course there was a huge numbers in the south of Ireland who were silenced, who were essentially pro-Irish and pro-British, who were Red Midnight, who sang God Save the King and sang God Save Ireland and so on and so forth. And it's fascinating, the emergence of this. Suddenly all over again, these people coming around with medals they're finding in the attic and all the rest. I'm astonished by it. And next thing, we're going to have the royal family coming in to celebrate 1916 with us. So can you imagine if you're on the Shankill Road trying to work out where this is going to? I mean, it's an absolutely extraordinary situation. So you have now, what is it, all these, 15 years down, 16 years down since the Good Friday Agreement, you have a changed political situation. You have growing disunity and political crisis in Britain. You have the whole European project being questioned as never before. And you have unionism about to shed another skin. Now, when I look at McAllister, I must say I have to laugh, because I heard the speech before. I heard the speech in the 60s, the 70s, the 80s. Well, we know that speech off by heart. We know what it means. It means we want to keep our foot in your neck. That's what it means. That's the subtext to all of that. It's dressed up in all sorts of diplomatic language, but that's what it means. And I'm really saddened to hear from Declan that this sort of attitude is beginning to spread through unionism. Now, what are they saying? Are they saying, if we collapse the institutions, we'll go back to Britain and say, we want a new deal, and who in Dublin is going to fight that one, and who in Westminster is going to fight that one? Or are they saying, well, direct will be better, because at least the Shinners won't be going around in Ministerial Mercedes, we'll still be part of Britain, and we can have more and more MPs at Westminster. And they are, of course, threatening a very, very dangerous political vacuum, because what has kept the North peaceful since the Good Friday Agreement is the sense that there's a political resolution, there's democracy at work, there's an equality agenda, that people, the nationalist population who struggled for all those years, have been rewarded, have taken something, and that the business is getting on, and lives are better, and there's peace, and Belfast is becoming a cappuccino society, and all of those things. You crash all that. They may be crazy enough to do it, and what you're left with, that creates a hugely dangerous vacuum. I have no expectation that any of the establishment political parties down here can have anything to do with this or can help this in any way. And I also have very deep concern. It has gone right down the list of preferences in Westminster. I must say the response to the so-called letters to the IRA prisoners by that Tory lady who runs the North, I was astonished with that, the way that was thrown out. To me, it was a signal that we may have reached very difficult and dangerous times. And I think what Declan has said is hugely important. It's a warning, and it's a warning from the trenches. And I just hope that we can hang on and keep paddling, but it's not very optimistic. Thank you.
I introduce you. Anne is going to give a presentation here. Anne works for the Pat Finucane Centre for Human Rights in Northern Ireland, and has recently published a wonderful book called Lethal Allies, British Collusion in Ireland, which again is highly informative to the activities, I suppose, of what was we can all recognise as a very dirty war and conflict over the last 30 odd years. Go ahead, Anthony.
Right, everyone, I'll do my best under the circumstances. The reason this slideshow is so important, the reason that these pictures are so important, is that I don't, as a former journalist, and as a doubting Thomas, I want to see evidence. I'm not interested in propaganda about collusion. I'm not interested in assumptions. I want hard evidence. There's been too much written, too many sloganizing about collusion. And collusion is absolutely vital to an understanding of what went on for 35 years. And because it's so important, it's absolutely vital that we don't exaggerate, we make no assumptions, that we base everything we say on hard evidence. And that's why there's more than 7,000 words of footnotes in Lethal Allies, because I don't want anyone to think that anything in that book has been written other than on the basis of hard, factual evidence. So that's why it's so important that even though you probably can't see what's on this computer, that you can see that there is something there. Just a few words about us, the Pat Finucane Centre. We're named after Pat Finucane. The reason is that we carry on his legacy of believing that the greatest single cause of conflict in the North was the breaking of the law and the inability to impartially uphold the rule of law, and that we work with families like Pat Finucane's who are desperately trying to find out the truth about what's happening. We're funded by the European Union. We work with individual families free of charge and in total confidence. First of all, why were legacy issues never included in the Good Friday Agreement? Were they more controversial than prison releases? Were they more controversial than Articles 2 and 3 of the Irish Constitution? As Winston Churchill said, history is written by the victors. History is vitally important. As William Faulkner, the US novelist, said, the past is never dead, it's not even past. The British have a great way of trying to tell Irish people to move on, to draw a line in the sand, to forget about the past. One of the main reasons is that if we truly examine the past of this country, we would be led to the inevitable conclusion that the Brits really misruled. People often ask the IRA, what was it all for? What was your war all for? People very rarely ask the British why they expended millions of pounds and hundreds of lives of soldiers to try and hang on to a bit of territory that has no worth to them, tactically, strategically, economically. If there was a referendum in Northern Ireland tomorrow, would you get as much passion in Westminster as has been in Scotland? No. The British have no love for Northern Ireland. and I speak coming from that tradition myself. So what was it that made them fight so hard for so long at such a cost to hold on to the 6 counties? And I've given this a great deal of thought. And my ultimate conclusion, and I could be wrong, is that it was more to do with their own self-image and their own desire to be seen on the world stage as a decent, honest, neutral broker between these two sectarian warring tribes in Ireland. Their own self-image was what I think, even if you accept that there's one, when you talk about the Brits, you're talking about MI5, RUC, all these different elements. But if you even think, what was it in Westminster that persuaded them to keep going? And unfortunately, I'm led to that conclusion. And if I'm right, then it means that London's war can never end. London is still fighting the war in the north. It's not a war with bullets or bombs, but it is a war, nevertheless, of words and ideas, which is why the past is so vitally important. This war will never end unless we get the truth or unless people give up asking questions. London will never give up voluntarily what went on. It'll never tell the truth voluntarily, because it's simply, if the truth was ever known, it will be a very ugly truth. So let's examine the evidence. At the start of the conflict, the London set up a new regiment of the British Army called the Ulster Defence Regiment. The Ulster Defence, 57,000 people passed through the Ulster Defence Regiment during its time. When they were setting up the UDR, this is a letter written right at the very start of the conflict. UDR membership of UDA, and the letter writer says, "It is inevitable that part of a Protestant element of a part-time regiment in Ulster will sympathise with the aims of the UDA. And it is suspected that there are areas where this sympathy is carried to the extent of active membership." So before they set up that regiment, they knew that inevitably loyalists would join it for the wrong reasons, to get trained, to get armed, to get organised, to carry out sectarian murder. And that's what happened. In August 1973, this document shows that they accepted themselves as a secret document that we found in the Kew under the 30-year rule. This document shows that they knew, in 1973, they knew that between 5 and 15% of every member of the UDR was an active loyalist. It seems likely that a significant proportion, perhaps 5%, in some areas as high as 15% of UDR soldiers, will also be members of the UDA, Vanguard, Service Corps, or any of these multifarious loyalist institutions. Just a word here about the UDA. It was only made illegal in August 1992. Throughout the conflict, the UDA was a legal organisation. It claimed, when it murdered people, it claimed the Ulster Freedom Fighters. And the UDA said, no, that's the Ulster Freedom Fighters, it's not us. And the Brits maintained that polite fiction until 1992. But as we can see from this document, which we've only just found, so this one's hot off the presses, folks, way back in 1976, this is an internal British Army, an internal British political assessment of the UDA. It, that is the UDA, tries to maintain a respectable front, and to this end either denies responsibility for sectarian murders and terrorist bombings, or claims them in the name of the Ulster Freedom Fighters, a prescribed and essentially fictitious organisation which is widely known to be a nom de guerre of the UDA. So London knowingly refused to prescribe the UDA for all those years when the UDA was out killing people. They knew it was the UDA killing people, and they let them continue as an illegal organisation. By the end of the conflict, the UDA had killed 408 people. They knew they had a problem in the UDR, we've seen that, but it wasn't a priority. They decided they weren't going to do anything about it. This document reads, "The discovery of members of paramilitary or extremist organisations in the UDR is not and has not been a major intelligence target. It seems unlikely that our intelligence coverage of this area is in any way comprehensive. Now, on the basis that 15% of UDR personnel, and that's likely to be, that's the Brits' own assessment, it's likely to be much higher than that. That means that 1,200 trained armed men in the UDR in 1970. That's how many there were in 1973. And of course, all these policies had a cost. It wasn't as though these policies didn't have a cost to anyone, that they were just policies passed on paper. All of this had a price, and the price was paid by people such as the Miami Show Band, who were killed by members of the UDR. These are ballistic links, and when I'm talking about hard evidence, that's what I mean. These are ballistic links between the weapons used to kill the Miami Show Band and other murders in the area around the same time. So the UDR members, there's potentially UDR members involved in all these other murders as well, because they shared guns between them. Dublin Monaghan, the worst single day of loss of life in the entire history of the conflict. 34 people killed in one day in Dublin and Monaghan. At least 2 UDR men involved in that. It's another story I'd like to tell you about, because it's particularly close to me, is that this was an explosion outside the town of Dungannon in 1974. A young couple were doing up a bungalow. Marion went to show her 2 brothers what she'd done, and they went off on a Monday morning to have a look and see the new hot press that they'd put in over the weekend when the bomb exploded. Killing her 2 brothers and herself. She was 8 months pregnant. Again, UDR involvement. The HET has told us they're absolutely satisfied that a UDR man who confessed to a similar bombing 6 weeks later, who wasn't even questioned by the RUC, was also involved in the Killeless bombing. These are 2 people who were members of the SDLP. They were on their way home from closing up a bar in Coal Island, and as they drew close to their house, the gunmen opened fire. They killed both of them, and they seriously wounded their young daughter, who was sitting in the car with them and who had to play dead, and she saved her own life that way. A UDR man was subsequently convicted, but he resigned on the day he was arrested. So when he appeared in court, he appeared not as a UDR man, he appeared as a telephone engineer. Another significant issue is the leaking of weapons to the UDR, from the UDR to the UDA and the UVF. This was systematic. We found over in the National Archives in Kew monthly reports. This happened every month. The British Army drew up a list of all the weapons that it had lost, in inverted commas, that it didn't know where they were. They'd just gone into the air. But we now know, and they knew then, that they were being leaked to the UDA and the UVF and being used to kill people. This wasn't a one-off. It happened month after month after month. They never told anybody about it. They never did anything about it. The word collusion, most people sort of seem to think that collusion became an issue after the murder of Pat Finucane. Wasn't for the Brits, because they knew way back in 1972, 1973, they knew there was significant collusion, and they called it that amongst themselves. They never admitted it in public, but in all the letters and documents that we found, the word collusion is repeated over and over again. Collusion, collusion, everywhere, throughout the literature, throughout the documents. This is one of the monthly logs I told you about. So then we have a list of all the weapons that have gone missing and where they've gone missing from. And the title of this document is Incidents of Suspected Collusion. And there's even a line at the bottom there. These are all the weapons that have gone missing, and this line at the bottom is where they suspect collusion. That is, they know their guns are out there in the community being used to murder people, and they did nothing about it. And again, someone had to pay the price. This man paid the price. There was a gun taken from Glenanne UDR base in 1971. The following year, it was used to kill Dennis Mullen. Again, he was a member of the SDLP. He was murdered on his own doorstep. His 4-year-old daughter witnessed it. The entire gang, actually, that killed him were either former or serving members of either the Territorial Army Volunteer Reserve, the UDR, or the RUC. It was so bad that the Brits wrote to themselves a document and told themselves that the main source of loyalist weapons and the only source of modern weapons for loyalists was the UDR. The UDR was their private arsenal. They just took what they wanted when they wanted. And when you're talking about modern weapons, we're talking here about high velocity submachine guns being stolen and used again and again and again. Dennis Mullen was killed by this gun. Another 3 people that were killed with the same weapon were the 3 Reevy brothers, who were shot dead as they watched television one New Year's, the 4th of January it was a New Year's party that was on at my house. Another 3 people who were shot dead by the same weapon, my colleague Alan Brecknell's father Trevor, 14-year-old Michael Donnelly, and 23-year-old Patsy Donnelly. So the outcome, the UDR was used as a surrogate force. It did the Brits' dirty work for them. They knew what was going on, and they did nothing about it. They just let them. In fact, they encouraged them. What was the outcome of all of this? The deaths of many Catholic non-combatants, of course, collapse of Catholic confidence in law and order, and a surge in support for Republican paramilitaries. So RUC men and UDR men were also, they lost their lives too. The conflict was prolonged by this policy of collusion and using the UDR and others as a surrogate force. The second thing I want to look at is the use of special branches. It's the RUC now, not the UDR. The way that special branch worked as a force within a force. You've often heard that before. So if the Criminal Investigation Department was investigating a murder or a bombing, they weren't given the intelligence that the Special Branch had. Special Branch became obsessed with intelligence and informers and kept all that knowledge to themselves instead of using it and letting others use it to arrest people. Whether it was because they were obsessed with knowing all about it, or there was this culture of we know what's really going on and cops and robbers, or whatever it was, whether it was even more sinister than that. The fact is they did not share the intelligence they had with the police who were doing the investigations. This is a story here of an explosion that took place in August 1976 at the Step Inn in the village of Cady in the mid-County Armagh. It is probably the worst case that we've investigated. There are probably just many of the other cases we've investigated probably just as bad. But the unique thing about this is that the paperwork is still there. The paperwork is all there. We've got a paper trail. We can prove what happened. These 2 people lost their lives. Elizabeth MacDonald, mother of 3, Gerard McLean, and young men just starting out in life. We know that the bomb car used was taken from an RUC officer in Belfast who recognised the people who took them as being in the UDA. The bomb was made by a second RUC officer. The explosives were provided by a UDR soldier. The bomb was stored at the farm of RUC officer James Mitchell. The RUC ordered watch on Mitchell's farm. British Army surveillance was ordered. The bomb route was scouted by an RUC officer. It was intended to bomb a bar in Clontibret on the Feast of the Assumption when the Hibernians would all be there. They then changed their mind because they knew that they were being watched. Instead, they bombed a Step Inn. There was no order to prevent the bombing. The surveillance was lifted, the bomb detonated, and although Special Branch knew the names of every single person involved, not a single person was arrested or charged or convicted. And that case is going to be, the new inquest has been opened. The family is suing the British government for misfeasance in public office, negligence, assault and battery, you name it. They're suing the MOD, they're suing the Chief Constable, and they're suing the British government. The Historic Inquiries team found the papers in the RUC files about the Step Inn, which is why we've got them, which is why we've got the proof that we need. They called it catastrophic. This is this man, RUC man James Mitchell. Mitchell's farmhouse in South Armagh was where the Step Inn was planned. He was a serving member of the RUC. It's also where the Dublin Monaghan bombing was stored on its way between Belfast and Dublin. Although the police were watching him in August 1976 and the bomb went off, so they knew that the bomb that had been made and stored on his farm was there, and they didn't stop it. They knew that he was involved. He remained on in the RUC for a further 10 months, and when his house was finally raided and they found a bomb factory there, he got a suspended sentence. These are 3 other RUC officers who were heavily involved in murder and bombing in the Mid-Armagh area at this time. They were members of the Special Patrol Group, a supposedly elite anti-terrorist unit. This is a bar that they blew up, called the Rock Bar. Mercifully, nobody was killed in this explosion, but every single member of the gang that attacked this bar was a serving member of the RUC. They used their radios to radio ahead to make sure they had a clear run. They threw an anti-personnel bomb at the bar. It exploded. Nobody was killed. One man was very seriously injured. He fell to the ground and rolled under a car. And as he was lying under the car, he could see all the feet of the people who were attacking the bar, and noticed that they were all wearing RUC boots. But he was never questioned or called as a witness. These are all the different attacks that are ballistically linked to the guns used at the Rock Bar. But when the RUC did finally arrest and charge those who were involved, or those of their own who were involved in the Rock Bar incident, they faced very minor charges, not attempted murder, not anything like that, just possession, and most of them got suspended sentences. And these are all the other attacks in which they were involved. None of those were investigated. They weren't even questioned about these other attacks to which they were ballistically linked. Why did the RUC look no further? We have to ask this again and again in this series of murders. And the reason the HET, who are former British police officers themselves and are all security vetted, so it's not a bunch of human rights activists or anything, these are cops themselves. The reason they give is that it was too embarrassing for the RUC for the investigations to proceed, that they simply covered it up, because if they'd gone further and asked the right questions, then the reputation of the RUC would have been shot to hell, and that would have been politically unacceptable. So it was more important to protect the RUC's reputation than it was to apprehend criminals. This gentleman here was charged with the murders of 4 people in a double gun and bomb attack in May 1976 in a little village called Charlemont. And the RUC officer in charge of the case told the court, oh no, he played no serious part in it. And as a result, although he was convicted of 4 murder counts, he got no recommendation as to the length of time he should spend in jail. These are the 4 people that he killed, all brothers and fathers. And 35 years later, the 4 families who were bereaved in that bombing, on that double bombing, were told that the man who killed their fathers and brothers was a serving RUC officer. He was never said in court that he was an RUC officer. It was hidden from the court. And again, the HET's verdict on this case is that there was apprehension that confirming the suspicions of collusion and involvement of RUC personnel would have fatally undermined the credibility of the organisation. The third issue I want to have a look at is the use of informers and agents. Has anyone heard of this man, Robin Jackson?
Yes.
I'm glad that some of you have. I've been in meetings where I've asked if people have heard of Robin Jackson, and nobody has. He was probably the most prolific murderer in the entire history of the conflict. He was also an RUC agent. So you have the man who killed more people than any other single person in the history of the Northern conflict was a paid RUC agent. And we know that. If you can get onto the PFC website and read the Miami Show Band report, a cop tricked him, and I won't go into details, it's quite complicated, but that we have proof that he was an RUC agent. There's now no doubt about it. This is the first man Robert Jackson murdered. He was a Banbridge trade unionist called Pat Campbell, who worked in the shoe factory in Banbridge with him for a while, actually. He was shot down on his front doorstep. His wife witnessed it. She was called to an ID parade. She identified Jackson immediately on the ID parade, but because she was so upset, she burst into floods of tears instead of putting her hand on his shoulder. And she did that 3 times. And that was one little bit of evidence against him. He also had too much ammo in his homes. He had names of Republicans in a book. He contradicted his story. There was masses of evidence against him, masses, but he wasn't charged with murder. We think that's when he was turned. We think he was turned then after the October 73 murder of Pat Campbell. So Jackson, from then on, we believe, became faced with the inevitability of a murder charge and conviction. He was turned and became an IUC agent. Colin Wallace is a whistleblower. He used to work for the British Army. He worked for the British Army for years. He's spoken out about what happened to him. A lot of you will have heard of Colin Wallace. Not everything he says may be 100% accurate, but a lot of it is. And it's difficult sometimes to tell the difference. But this is a very interesting handwritten note that we found in the files. And it's a list of loyalists that Colin Wallace drew up, asking which one should he target and which one shouldn't he for black propaganda. And this reads, Robin Jackson was charged with the murder of Patrick Campbell in October last year. Charges were dropped following RUC Special Branch intervention. QED, in my view. Robin Jackson died of cancer eventually, in age 49 in 1992. And Colin Wallace wrote a kind of obituary of sorts in the Irish Independent. Everything people have whispered about Robin Jackson for years was perfectly true. He was a hired gun, a professional assassin. He was responsible for more deaths in the North than any other person I knew. The jackal killed people for a living. The state not only knew he was doing it, its servants encouraged him to kill its political opponents and protected him. So how have we discovered all this? Well, looking. National Archives, both here in Dublin and Belfast and also in London. Newspaper libraries, talking to people, listening to whistleblowers. But we're limited because we can't get access to the RUC archives, which are stored outside Carrickfergus in County Antrim. So the book, Lethal Allies, which I wrote last year, which we published last year, which has sold 15,000 copies to date, catalogues 120 deaths, all carried out by permutations of the same gang. The gang all had links with RUC and the UDR. They were infiltrated and protected. The black triangles show where the 3 main groups of this gang were. They shared guns and personnel, and the red triangles show where they carried out their murders. A lot of people say, okay, well, there was collusion, fair enough, okay, but it wasn't high up, it was low down, it was just individual people out there who were getting away with it. The HET doesn't believe that. Again, I emphasize, the HET are made up of mostly 30, 40 years have served in British police forces. When they first came over here, the ones we met, when we talked about collusion, so you would see them sort of going, oh yeah. After very, very short time, when they'd actually got to see the files, they became as convinced as we were. And London's failure to act at a high level was highlighted in a report into the murder of Sean Farmer and Colin McCartney. Colin McCartney was Seamus Heaney's cousin. They were on the way back from Croke Park, and they were stopped at a fake UDR patrol about a month after the Miami show band, and they were both shot dead like dogs on the side of the road. And the HET's conclusion is that indisputable evidence of security forces involved with loyalist paramilitaries in one case, followed by significant evidence of further cooperation just weeks later, should have rung alarm bells all the way to the top of government. Nothing was done. The murderous cycle continued. Now, this is a very interesting letter because it's very, very rare. When you go to the National Archives in Kew, most of the really controversial, damning stuff has either been censored or there's been an extension of the 30-year rule. Sometimes, some files it's 50 years instead of 30 years. But this slipped through the net, and we found it. This is an account of a meeting between Harold Wilson and Merlin Rees, the then Labour Prime Minister and his Northern Ireland Secretary, Merlin Rees, with the newly elected leader of the opposition, Margaret Thatcher, and her advisor on Northern Ireland, Eire Neve. So you have the British Prime Minister, the British Northern Ireland Secretary, with the leader of the Conservative Party and her advisor on Northern Ireland. Anyhow, in the middle of this meeting, Mr. Rees, Merlin Rees, says the British Army's judgment was that the UDR were heavily infiltrated by extremist Protestants and that in a crisis situation they could not be relied upon to be loyal. So however many times Margaret Thatcher praised the UDR in public, and she did often at every opportunity, she knew way back in September 1975 that the UDR was heavily infiltrated. The HET doesn't buy the rotten apple theory either. They said they found a much more disturbing picture with the potential to validate claims of widespread and routine collusion. Proving collusion, of course, is terribly difficult. It's a unique crime. All you need is two people together having a conversation. That could be collusion. So it is terribly difficult to prove it because obviously the colluders are not going to leave a paper trail or any evidence. So it's incredibly hard to prove, which is why it's so important to look at what the British did before they came to Ireland. Before they came here, what did they do in other countries? And what have they done in other countries since they left here? It just fits into the pattern. Not in every country is slightly different depending on the circumstance, but everywhere they've gone, they've used local people to do their dirty work. Palestine, Kenya, Malaya, Aden, Cyprus. This, sometimes I see people glazing over when I talk about this, but it's actually a fascinating area of research that hasn't been plumbed very hard. I really enjoy doing it. I was horrified, but I really enjoyed doing the research. Sir Frank Kitson, he developed the theory of using people to fight their own neighbours way back in Kenya in the 1950s. And there was special, in Ireland it had to be adapted because it's not the same killing people in Ireland, so close to London it is to killing people far away in Africa. You have to be more careful and cover your tracks. So why did London tolerate collusion and sanction it? And my own view, and this is my own view, is that if you can't destroy the IRA, cut off their air supply. If you can't kill the fish, poison the water. Those targeted, and we've looked at the ones targeted, not the people killed at random, but those ones who were actually targeted. They were all young families, people who were making a good life for themselves. They'd either bought a new house, or they were doing up an old house, or they'd set up a business, or they had a bit of land or a bit of property. None of the people who were targeted and killed were unemployed Republicans. They targeted the outwardly mobile Catholic, not middle class, but people who were who had aspirations, that generation after the Beveridge Education Act, people who were getting on in the world. And the theory was, I believe the theory was to spread so much fear in the population that people would repudiate Republicans, would turn their back on Republicans and demand an end to the IRA campaign. So the Brits were using the ordinary population. The people who died, well, it was just too bad for them. And this is why collusion is so important when we interpret the conflict. The dominant narrative, I think we'll all agree, is that the conflict in the north was tribal and religious, that Britain's role was as a neutral and benevolent umpire, that the loyalists and Republicans, well, they were just all as bad as each other. They were all both as bad as each other. And certainly where I come from in London, that is what most people's theory and narrative of the northern conflict is. If you accept that collusion was widespread and systemic and ordered from a high level, which I now do, I didn't for a long while, but I now do, the alternative narrative is that the conflict was colonial or post-colonial, that Britain was a protagonist, key protagonist using classic counterinsurgency tactics. Loyalists were in part, at least, British surrogates. Republicans were also to a lesser extent manipulated, and some of that truth will come out too. Anyhow, the political response we've had has been good in parts. There was an adjournment debate at Westminster about the book. We've had meetings with Good Friday Implementation Committee down here. We've met with the former Taoiseach Eamon Gilmore, we've met President Higgins, we've gone to Brussels, we have had meetings in Washington with some pretty heavy hitters, and we're going back to Washington next month. As for the British government, there has been no response. We offered them the text of the book 6 weeks in advance of publication so they could sit and think about it rather than just knee-jerk. They declined that offer. Since then, we've asked them 5 times for meetings. They've declined every one, and this is the last letter we got from Theresa Villiers. She says her officials are still considering the very serious matters raised in your book, and they will be contacting us in the autumn. We hope that'll be a year since the book was out. Now let's contrast the two governments' responses between Smithick and this. The Smithick Tribunal found collusion on the balance of probabilities in 2 killings, that of RUC officers Harry Breen and Bob Buchanan. On the balance of probabilities, there was no hard or ballistic or forensic evidence, and it resulted in a contrite apology from the Irish government and the Garda Commissioner. We, on the other hand, have found mountains of evidence, hard evidence, of collusion in over 120 killings. There's been no apology from London, no statement expressing regret or apology, not even a meeting. So what next? Well, we have between 25 and 30 cases before the police ombudsman in the north, new inquests, announcements due shortly on legal plans. There's action being planned against the Chief Constable, the MOD and the British government. All of this, of course, is hugely expensive and very traumatic for the families involved. They don't want to have to be forced into legal action. And what we're saying is that it's about time that Dublin took a much more active role in this. Okay, fair enough, we're glad that Dublin and London are all pally now. But a friendship, if it's to be a true friendship, has to be based on honesty and equality. It's not a master-slave relationship. London still fights against us seeing the Dublin Monaghan bombing files, and by taking the stand on this and other issues, it shouldn't be putting that new relationship with London at risk. London does not respect weakness. It's long past time an Irish government respectfully stood up for the rights of its citizens. As far as we're concerned, the only policy the Brits have is deny, deny, deny. And when the evidence is there and cannot be denied, then it's delay, delay, delay. That's the only 2 things they know anything of. That's their response to everything. The Haas proposals, the Haas-O'Sullivan proposals were a real step forward, but they were jumped on by the unionists. So just summing up then, did the ends justify the means? Was collusion justified on the grounds that the state faced a vicious, ruthless and determined enemy? Did collusion save a single life? Did it end the conflict a day earlier? We say it didn't. We say it prolonged the conflict. It was a tragic, desperate, unforgivable mistake that the Brits made. There is a danger that lethal allies will become unique. There is a danger. There really is. I think that they've seen what has been found. The British and the Northern Ireland authorities have seen what we found. And although we lifted a corner of the carpet, they're going to want to nail it down again. If they possibly can do, as I said at the start, London will fight to the bitter end to hide its secrets. It will use every device at its disposal. On the other hand, if you look at it more optimistically, Declan was talking about reconciliation. It'll be a long road, and there will be many narratives at the end of that road, but there is the possibility that in understanding how each side saw the conflict and what was really going on in the background and how the British were exploiting and manipulating people, that it might just end with both communities feeling a bit easier with each other. That's what we hope. It's not a hopeless case. The Brits have apologised in the past for things they've done. Hillsborough, Bloody Sunday, the Stephen Lawrence inquiry. The sky didn't fall in. You know, it lifts a burden off the state as well as off the people who were at the receiving end of these policies. So anyhow, I've zipped through that. Thank you very much for listening, and I'll certainly answer